So the story, like we said, was done by P.L. Travers, and so the very first book that she wrote within the Mary Poppins series came out in 1934. So she wrote 8 books in total, and 5 of them had come out before 1964. So the first one came out in 1934, the next one in 35, the one after that in 43, then you had one in 52, and you had the 5th one in 1962. However, Disney, all the way back in 1938, had made a promise to his daughters at the time that he was going to make a film out of Mary Poppins. However, when he went to P.L. Travers, she's very much like Mary Poppins. She's kind of no nonsense, right? And she basically said that, like, no, I don't think that, like, you can make a film of my things. I don't think you'll ever be able to do the stories justice. Because don't forget, at this time in 1938, Disney had just made Snow White, great, so it's, absolutely great cartoon film. But at this point, he hadn't made any live action films. So throughout the next few decades, right, he kept making live action films and would show it to the P.L. Travers and say, see, look, I can make live action films now, right? But she still wasn't convinced. So it took until 1961 where finally she was like, okay, cool, fine, we can make a film of it. However, I get the final say with regard to the script, right? So she demanded and then later obtained the rights to the script approval process, right? So well done for her. But there ended up being a few changes with regard to this along the way. So it was the Sherman brothers, who we mentioned in the last video, right? So they're the guys who focused on the music, but they're the ones who suggested that instead of the story being set in the 1930s, as it was in the original books, instead it should be set to Edwardian England, right? So this is in the 1910s. So this decision was made, and then it took about 2 years for them to produce and to compose the actual songs for the story. So that kind of covers the story of the creative process that went into it, but there's also stuff to do with the story of the studio, which we have to speak about. So with regard to the story of the studio, first of all, she wasn't very happy with how Mary Poppins ended up being portrayed. So Travers, in her original stories, Mary Poppins is made to be a much sterner character. So you see elements of this within the film, but nowhere near as harsh as she was meant to be in the books. Yeah? So he didn't like the fact that Disney had kind of softened her up. On top of that, she had flat out said that she didn't want any animation within the film, which might explain why, the special effects are great, but the animation at most times is actually quite poor, with some very notable exceptions, which we'll cover a little bit later. And then there's also the fact that she wanted the songs within the film to be songs from that actual era, right? As opposed to the newly composed songs just made for that film. Now, while Disney had given her rights with regard to the script, he retained the ultimate right because he's the one who was making the film. So on all 3 of these points, he said no, no, no. And so basically they ended up pushing ahead with all 3 of these things, much to Travis's annoyance. However, he did listen to the fact of having animation at a minimal, right? Which is why the film emphasizes so much the use of special effects. Now, how they did the special effects is a little bit different from how they normally would do it. So normally they would have a blue screen. Behind me now is actually a green screen. I know a lot of people think I'm actually sat in a library and stuff, but no. But the thing is with this, right? So instead of using a blue screen, they used a white screen, right? And so with this white screen, what they did is they put sodium vapor lights on it, right? So this is the sodium vapor process. So what this does is it kind of gives it a bit of a yellowy tinge, and it helps to separate the actors, who are on screen from the cartoon characters. So rather than it being like how it used to be and stuff, where the kind of characters and the actors are kind of right next to each other and stuff, instead it looks very much like the actors are kind of immersed within the cartoon world, right? So it makes it a much more kind of realistic kind of thing. So that effect was really notable within the film, and it's actually one of the reasons why it won one of its many Academy Awards, right? And it's just for the special effects, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So of course, obviously, we can't talk about the story of the studio without talking about the casting. And actually, because this film was so highly anticipated, right, it had a huge kind of repertoire of people that they could have had. So for instance, Jane Banks was going to be played by Hayley Mills. So Hayley Mills is the daughter of Sir John Mills, both of which were absolutely fantastic English actors and stuff, very, very famous. And then for the role of Mary Poppins, originally they were going to have Betty Davis, and then they were going to have the late, great Angela Rainsbury. However, they finally decided to settle on Julie Andrews. So Julie Andrews would later be in The Sound of Music and would also be in The Princess Diaries many decades later, and in many other films as well. However, this film actually represents her film debut. So she'd never been in any film before, but like we said in the last video, right, Disney in 1960 had seen her in the musical Camelot, and this is probably where he got the idea of casting her for the role of this. And actually, I should say a little bit with regard to this. Julie Andrews wanted to be Eliza Doolittle in My Fair Lady. However, Audrey Hepburn ended up taking that role. So then when it came to the Oscars of that year, right, it's a thing where Julie Andrews ended up winning it and Audrey Hepburn didn't, right? And then I think it was either the Oscars or the Academy Awards or one of the other ones, right? She wasn't even nominated, but Julie Andrews ended up winning it, right? So again, very funny, like kind of turn of events that, you know, the role that she wanted, she didn't end up getting, but then she ended up being in an even like better film as such, right? And I think that her role is absolutely brilliant. The casting is brilliant for her. Next, obviously, you have Bert, who is Dick Van Dyke. So the reason he was picked was not to do with his accent, which is absolutely terrible, right? Although he claimed later that he was trained by J. Pat O'Malley, who we've covered in our video to do with Alice in Wonderland, and also he appears in some minor like voice roles within this. So although he said that he was trained by him, Dick Van Dyke's accent in this is so bad it's been voted as, I think, like the worst like film accent in all of the history of film. So it's, you know, his character is really charming, it's really funny and stuff, but at the same time his accent at times it's just really unbearable, right? Although as a kid you don't tend to really notice these things, right? But you have him, and then in terms of George Banks, you have David Tomlinson. Now, David Tomlinson hadn't been in anything too major up until this point. However, later on, he would be cast in Bedknobs and Broomsticks, which would come out in 1971. And next you had the person who was playing Winifred Banks, and this was played by Glynis Johns, right? So Glynis Johns, she was kind of in very minor British films, and she flat out refused to be in any American films because for some reason she didn't like any of the American films that she saw at that time, which is incredibly like a sweeping kind of statement to kind of make. I think probably she just probably couldn't master an American accent, more likely than not. But either way, so she plays the mum within this. And also, of course, you have the two children, and this was voiced by Karen Dotrice and Matthew Garber. So both of these were in the film Three Lives of Thomasina from 1963. So in that, they're kind of like a brother and sister duo, and so Disney probably saw this film and decided to cast them because like they seem to like work quite well together. And then in terms of the Admiral, he is voiced by Reginald Owens, who is later on in Bedknobs and Broomsticks. And then you have Ed Wynn, and he is Uncle Albert in this, but he's also in Alice in Wonderland. He is the voice of the Mad Hatter. So definitely need to check out that Alice in Wonderland video for more kind of like information regarding him. And then finally, with regard to the different characters within this, obviously you had many other like actors and for many other roles within this, but these are just looking at like, the main people. But the maid, Ellen, right, she absolutely is hilarious in this. She has many great lines, which we'll cover a little bit later. But she is played by Hermione Baddeley, and she is in many classic British films, such as Passport to Pimlico, which came out in 1949, Do Not Disturb with Doris Day, which came out in 1965, and then she's also within The Aristocats, which we'll cover in a few weeks' time, right? And that's from 1970. So that kind of covers the story of the studio, right? So now we're going to talk about the themes and the history of the actual film. So the themes within this, right, it's very much a typical film from the 1960s where you have a lot of counterculture. So in particular, during that era, you still had a thing where England in particular was still one foot in the Edwardian era and then the other foot in basically the modern era, right? So the 1960s saw many times where like you had films where they were critiquing Edwardian values, Edwardian kind of stiff upper lip, very kind of straight-laced and repressed and stuff, right? And so this is really exemplified with the role of George Banks. So the whole film is a kind of critique against him and also like, all the values that he like, has, yeah, with regard to like the empire and like the role of men and women and blah, blah, etc., etc. But then also I think that another great theme within this is one of the importance of family. So within this, right, you have both parents who are subsumed by their ideas, right? So you have George, who is subsumed by the kind of like these very traditional like views of like, you know, stiff upper lip and how an English gentleman should be. But then equally, you have the mum, who is really focused on being a suffragette, great, but at the same time, she's also quite hypocritical in the sense that she's actually very subservient at home still, right? but neither of them are really focusing on the needs of the children. And so it's basically saying that, it doesn't matter what your ideas are, it doesn't matter about all the kind of hopes and dreams you have and stuff. At the end of the day, if you don't take care of your kids, then you're never going to get those years back, right? So that's something that's really emphasized. And so the final scene where they end up going on a kite thing, right? It's not just a thing where George takes them to go and fly the kite. No, it's important that both father and mother go to take their children to the park. Yeah, so now you have an actual happy family, whereas before you just had a household. So that explains the kind of themes and history of it, right? And now talk about the legacy of the film. So